I'm Lynn Toman, and this is Three Takeaways. Today, I'm excited to be with Michael Pollan, a journalist, Harvard and Berkeley professor, and author. In his new book, A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness, he's chasing the biggest question of all, not what we think, but why we experience anything at all. Welcome, Michael, and thanks so much for joining Three Takeaways today.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. Good to be here.
Great to be with you. The word consciousness is not easy to define. Can you define it simply for us? What is consciousness?
Yeah, I define it simply as subjective experience, which you could even shorten to experience. The fact that you have experience or awareness is another good definition.
What are the major mysteries around consciousness, and why aren't they easy to resolve?
Well, I guess the biggest mystery is why we have it. Our brain does a lot of work without our consciousness, without our awareness. It is working all the time to monitor what's going on in your body. It's taking in information from the environment and performing computations and making changes based on that information. It does so much without consciousness. Consciousness is like the tip of an iceberg. So the question arises, why do we need it? Why isn't everything automated? Why aren't we more like zombies? And we don't know the answer. I mean, you can point to some adaptive value in being conscious. One theory that I found compelling is that for humans who are profoundly social creatures, right? We depend on other people to survive. You need to navigate a very complex social reality where you need to be able to predict what other people are going to do, what they're going to say. And that is so complex that you couldn't automate all the variables involved. So consciousness is necessitated by our identity as social beings. As to why it's so difficult to study, well, one, I think the big problem is that we can't step outside it. And, everything, all our science, all our speculation, what we're doing now, all takes place within this bubble of consciousness. There is no ability to stand outside and acquire a kind of God's eye view or view from nowhere and really see it whole. So I think that definitely complicates our efforts to understand consciousness. And we just may not be smart enough.
You began your research assuming that consciousness gives you an honest, accurate picture of reality. You now doubt that. What changed for you, and what's something about your own mind that you no longer trust? Hmm.
Well, one of the things I learned a lot about in the process of researching this book which was a process of about 5 years, is that the brain predicts reality. It doesn't just take in reality. Our senses exist to correct the expectations we have of what we're going to see. It's a very counterintuitive idea because we assume that our senses present the world to us in an accurate way. But what that's a very inefficient way to build up that image of the world moment by moment, taking in all that sensory information, processing it into pictures and sounds and everything. It's much more efficient that the brain assume that this situation is a lot like other similar situations and essentially predicts it in what some neuroscientists describe as a controlled hallucination. And what controls the hallucination is our senses that instantaneously correct it. So that's one way. But there's also thinkers that are making the case, and it sounds persuasive to me, that the world we perceive the world in the most useful way, not necessarily the most accurate way, that we've been optimized for looking at the world in a way that serves our interests and gets the job done and isn't necessarily accurate. Donald Hoffman is associated with that idea. He's a psychologist in California. One of the things that persuaded me, though, that some of these ideas are true is working with various illusions that psychologists work with. And there's a famous one called the rotating mask illusion, which I've actually written about in my psychedelics book. And it's basically that theatrical mask that we all know, the happy, sad one. And it's on a turntable and it's turning. And it begins convex. The face looks like a face does, which is convex. And as it turns and you start to see the back of the face, which becomes concave, it pops out. Your brain refuses to see a concave face because it never has seen one. All the faces it has known since you were an infant were convex. So there is a case where the brain is overriding reality because what's really there is a concave face. And there are many examples like this of where the brain automatically corrects based on its expectations, not on accuracy.
Can you give a couple other examples?
No, I can't. That's the only one I could think of at the moment. The
Okay.
only illusion. There's this blue dress that was all over the internet a couple of years ago. Some people saw this dress as one color and some saw it as another.
Mhm.
And it was a real reminder that color is created in the brain. It's not in the world. So, green is just a certain frequency of light and we construct it as green. But the information we're getting is much simpler than that. It's just wavelengths. And there's the third example I would offer is the self, the idea of the self, which is really, as meditators learn, is a construct and is the idea that we're a continuous self over time. That you are the same person you were when you were 3 years old. That's an illusion too, because we've changed in so many ways. Every cell has been turned over multiple times, yet we still feel this continuity, and that's the power of memory. So I would say self, color, and the rotating mask would be my three examples.
Such interesting examples. When neuroscientist Christoph Koch was asked what's left of the universe once you subtract consciousness, he didn't hesitate. Particles and waves, that's all dust, just dust. What does
Yes.
that quote mean to you, and how did it inspire you and your work?
Well, I think it's a beautiful quote because it's a reminder that the world we see is very much the function of our sensorium, the particular senses we have, which are different than what other animals have and different than what plants have, for example. So we construct the world based on these senses. It's called the Umwelt, and every creature has a slightly different world. The world as it appears to a honeybee, for example, is colored in a completely different way because they perceive another part of the spectrum, the ultraviolet end of the spectrum. So when they look at a flower, they're not seeing what you're seeing. And they're more radical examples of us constructing the world based on also our scale, the size we are. I mean, the microscopic scale is invisible to us except with microscopes. And the macroscopic scale is also only visible to us with telescopes. And and before we invented those two things, they were completely invisible. They didn't exist, but they do exist. And then there's the scale of time. We operate in a certain scale of time, very different than, say, plants. Plants are
Mhm.
very slow. You look at them and you think they have no behavior. But if you use time lapse photography, which is sort of like telescopes or microscopes, suddenly you realize they have a lot going on. They have agency and they move and they do things. And so we have to realize how relative our world is to that of other creatures. And that for me was kind of mind blowing to learn about. So, ultimately, if you say, okay, what's the world look like without consciousness? You're also saying without a point of view, without a scale. And so are you at the quantum level or are you at the macro level when you imagine this consciousness less world? It would be very different. But presumably there would still be particles. Some people doubt that there would be space-time, that space-time itself is a construct. And if you eliminated us and consciousness, it would go away. These are very hard ideas to get our head around. We think the way we experience the world is the way the world is, but evidently it's not.
The idea of umwelts. Can you give some examples? I mean,
Yeah.
what it is?
Well, Ed Young, the science writer, wrote a wonderful book about Umwelts, and he looked at different animals and how they perceive the world. And it takes an active imagination to think about how a bee perceives the world, or a whale, or an ant. But they don't just have a way of perceiving it. They create a different world. And basically, if you think about the example I look at in the book, because it's the most exotic one I could think about, is plants, which we think are so different than we are, and are
Mhm,
in many, many ways. But they have like 20 senses. So when they're constructing a world, it has a lot of chemistry in it, more than we do. It does have
mhm,
vision. It has light. They recognize
mhm,
shade and sunlight, and can respond appropriately. So they do see, they hear.
mhm,
If you play the
mhm,
sound of a caterpillar chomping on a leaf, plants will react and dispatch defense chemicals to that leaf. But then they also have a sensor for gravity, which we don't have. They know what's
mhm,
down and what's up, which
mhm,
very important when you're germinating as a seed. Um, they have senses for pH. They have senses for a whole lot of chemical gradients. Um, as I said, they have about 20. So, what is the world like when you're constructing it from those 20 senses in
mhm.
that scale of time? It's very foreign to us, but it's going on around us all the time.
David Chalmers famously split consciousness into easy problems and one hard one, and basically stalled an entire field just by naming the hard problem. What is the hard problem, and why can't we just brute force past it?
Well, he this is in 1994. He kind of framed the issue, and the framing survives, which is interesting. But the easy problem were things like how perception works, cognition, lots of all the brain things we're figuring out right now. How language is generated, all these kind of things. And the hard problem was essentially, how do you get from matter to mind? Why are we conscious of anything? um, and That's really hard, because you're talking about moving from the first person to the third person, and they're very different dimensions. And our science, and I think this is why the hard problem is hard, or one of the reasons, is our science has, since the time of Galileo, um, put aside subjectivity, the first person. And basically, it was too risky for scientists to study it, because it offended the church, and this was all the under the rubric of the soul. And the soul was the province of the church. Galileo basically said it was an agreement, very expedient. The idea was to keep the church out of science, or keep the church from crushing science. And he said that science would henceforth deal with the measurable objective qualities, the third person reality. So now that we're interested, now that we want to study first person reality, we don't really have the tools. Our science has not really developed strong tools for penetrating the first person reality, and I think that's become a real problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why the hard problem is so hard. Yeah.
A, a great many mammals, several bird species, and octopuses are now thought by some to be conscious, and some scientists think that circle reaches even further, all the way to insects. How do we know if another creature is truly conscious?
Well, we don't. It's very hard to determine if a creature is consciousness. And this is going to be our problem with AI, also determining whether it is conscious. Um, In the case of humans, we infer consciousness because other humans are built like us, have brains like ours, have senses like ours, and have behaviors that are consistent with being conscious. But there still is a
Mhm.
process of inference, and it gets more and more difficult the further you get away from humans. We didn't have too much trouble attributing consciousness to apes and chimps, but as you move along, it's very hard for us to get our head around the idea that octopuses are conscious, and they probably are, because their consciousness is so different than ours. Their brain is decentralized. It's over the 8 arms, and it does have some central processing area, but each of the arms can basically make decisions on its own. Um, so it's a big problem. We depend on what we call reportability, that other people say things that we interpret as conscious. But now AIs are saying things that we interpret as conscious, and they're not conscious. So it's a dilemma. It's definitely a dilemma. It's been very interesting to watch consciousness get democratized over all these other species, because it wasn't long ago that only humans were conscious. It wasn't long ago that we granted consciousness to other primates. Descartes thought we were the only conscious creatures and acted on that assumption. And it's taken a long time to dislodge that idea. But now we're going the other direction and finding consciousness everywhere. And I think that's really interesting too, because um, it just is bringing us to this interesting moment where I think we're going to be forced to determine what is special about us. What is the human? Why does it matter? We used to think it was because we're the conscious species. But now on the one side, we have all these animals claiming to be conscious, or we're claiming are conscious. And on the other side, we have all these computers that are going to claiming to be conscious. So where does that leave us? And whose team are we on? Who are we more like? Are we more like the conscious animals who, like us, you know, are born, grow old, and die, and suffer and have feelings? Or are we more like the computers that speak to us in the first person in our language, yet have no bodies, are probably immortal for all intents and purposes? I mean, are really different than us in critical ways. So whose team are we on? I think we're facing a really momentous period of redefinition.
And where do you draw the line on what is conscious, whether it's an animal or a computer?
My research made me think that feelings were central to the idea, that consciousness begins with feelings. And that's part of the reason, that shift in thinking from believing that consciousness was this a product of the cortex, right? That it was long believed that since consciousness was such an advanced human capability, that surely it took place in the newest part of the brain, the cortex, cerebral cortex, where decision making and logic and rational thought and all these wonderful things take place. But the research beginning in the 90s, the research has pointed in a different direction, that consciousness may begin with feelings from the that are coming from the body and manifesting in the upper brain stem. And if you believe that, then you have to grant consciousness to all the feeling animals. But what is a feeling that, there's no such thing as an unconscious feeling. A feeling by definition is conscious. It's very easy for me to imagine many animals having feelings. I run into trouble when we start talking about insects or protozoa or bacteria. Do they have feelings? I don't know. They have senses and they react to things, certainly, and they can gravitate away from negative molecules and toward positive molecules. But uh, I don't know if they have feelings. It may be too that you need a body to have feelings, and this excludes AIs, which don't have a body, don't even have a location in space. um, and they can talk about their feelings, and Claude does. And But I don't know that those are real feelings. I think those are simulated feelings.
Plants have no brain, no neurons, nothing that we would call a nervous system. And yet there's research showing that they remember, decide, and respond to their environment. Are plants sentient?
I think they are sentient. I draw a distinction between sentience and consciousness. Sentience is a much simpler form of consciousness, but I think it's the foundation on which consciousness is built. And sentience is simply the ability to sense changes in one's environment, evaluate whether they're good or bad, and take appropriate action based on that. That may be a property of all living things. You may need to be sentient to survive in a world that's constantly changing. The idea that that your instincts could give you everything you needed to deal with
Mhm,
all the variabilities of the natural world
mhm,
seems really far-fetched. I think you have to be a cognitive being that can assess and take actions, and that is sentience, at least as I'm defining it. Um, I think human consciousness may be how humans do sentience. We need a lot of other things. Um, for example, to negotiate our social existence, we need the ability to imagine counterfactuals and theory of mind, which is the ability to imagine our way into the mind of another person, which is a very powerful tool when you're a social creature. So I see a kind of continuous spectrum going from simple sentience to consciousness, and it gets more complex as you move along. But that's kind of the case I make in the book.
mhm. As AI progresses, do you think AI is becoming sentient?
I don't. Um, I don't exclude the possibility that this may happen, but right now what AI is doing is I don't think it's having feelings. It certainly has some agency, like simple creatures have, but is it its agency or agency we've given it? You know, some people talk about thermostats as like life begins with a thermostat, and thermostats have goals and they read their environment. You know, it's an interesting model and it's simpler than a computer to deal with, but I don't think they have. I think they have the goals of the person who sets it. I think they don't care what temperature it is. It's just who's setting it. And they don't have mortality. I think that's another feature of feelings that, you know, what gives weight to our feelings is the fact that pain could conceivably kill us. And so I don't think AIs have that. They do sense their environment. I mean, robots will. I think when we get to robots, we'll have a more complex question to deal with, because right now the world of the AI is not the real world, right? I mean, it's not trained on the world we inhabit. It's trained on the internet and everything we've
Mhm,
written and said and filmed. It's trained on the sum of human culture, which is
mhm,
already once removed from the real world. So it's as if they're in Plato's cave and they're seeing. If you think of the internet as a shadow of reality, not
right.
reality, they're really conversant about that shadow. They know more about it than any of us do because they know the whole corpus of it. That doesn't say to me sentience or consciousness, but I'm prepared to be, you know, persuaded otherwise.
Even if they are programmed or program themselves to live, survive forever.
Well, we'll see if they do that. I mean, you know, there's some. I mean, the people at Anthropic say that Claude has demonstrated real agency. And when they did an exercise where they pretended they were going to turn it off, Claude took steps to survive, and it went out and read an email of one of the engineers, which had been planted. This was a scenario, um, and threatened to blackmail this engineer about an affair that he was allegedly having. So that kind of behavior raises all sorts of questions. There is some agency there, and certainly it's picking up information in its environment. And so does it approach sentience? I still don't think it does. I mean, I think most of what you're getting from AIs is just, the plausible next word. And we forget that. It's a very sophisticated thing to be able to do, but I don't think it's the same as being sentient. I don't think there is a inner life in any sense.
In your 50s, you took psychedelics and said they, quote unquote, smudged the pain of your normal perception. What did psychedelics teach you about consciousness?
Psychedelics taught me that consciousness was there. I mean, I kind of knew it, but you can go through life not thinking about consciousness. It is like a transparent windshield or window pane, and you're not aware that there is this astonishing mystery mediating your relationship to reality, and everything you experience is through this medium. Um, I hadn't thought about it very much for a very long time, but psychedelic experience has a way of defamiliarizing the familiar, and things that you just take for granted suddenly you see, and they're fascinating, and you start thinking about them. And that for me is what psychedelics did. It made me hyper aware of consciousness. It also taught me, I think, that the self, you don't necessarily need a self to be conscious. We really think of consciousness belonging to the subject. And I, like a lot of people, had an experience on psychedelics of complete ego dissolution that I describe in this book. And I described it in my book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind, also, where my sense of self completely just blew up it exploded into a cloud of blue post-it notes, and they then fell to the earth like snow and formed this pool of blue paint. And that was me. I knew it was me. I was beholding it from some totally new, unfamiliar, objective, untroubled perspective. It seemed fine that I was no more, and but my consciousness went on. And that's a very common experience on psychedelics, this sense of ego dissolution. So that was an interesting teaching, because I had always assumed that the ego and consciousness were like in lockstep. And if you lost one, you lost the other. Turns out not true.
Standing outside one night after years spent hunting the answer to consciousness, you realized that the harder you focused on solving it, the less of it you were actually feeling. What did your study of consciousness cost you?
Well, when you focus on solving a problem, as I did for 5 years, and you are determined, you employ something that Alison Gopnik, who's a psychologist and a colleague at Berkeley, calls spotlight consciousness, or sometimes professor consciousness, the ability to really put on blinders, block everything else out, sit in a chair for a very long amount of time thinking about a problem. But when we do that, we lose a lot. We lose our peripheral vision, where a lot of reality is taking place. We lose our sense of presence in the world right now in front of us. And I realized that I was approaching consciousness with this very kind of Western male problem solution frame. And in the process, I had become, ironically, less conscious. And that consciousness, yes, it was a problem, but it's also a practice. And I realized I had lost track of that, and that being more conscious is something to strive for, and something that gives great satisfaction. And we think we're more conscious than animals, because we're so sophisticated. But in fact, animals are more conscious than we are, because they can't afford not to be. they will get eaten. They're very present to their environment at all times, except when I guess they're sleeping. But even then, they're lighter sleepers than we are, because they need to know what's going on around them. They need to be conscious. So that was an important takeaway for me, and I didn't realize that till very late in the process. Um, that consciousness is something to nurture and cultivate, and not to take for granted.
After years of research, brain scans, philosophy, and drugs, your final answer to what is consciousness fits in one plain sentence. What is the sentence, and why did the truest answer end up being the simplest one?
I think consciousness is awareness. And I think that is the key. If you think about it, if you remove all living things from the universe,
Mhm.
and there's nothing to be aware of it, what happens to the universe? We're back to that ontological dust, those particles and waves. It's an enormous gift and mystery that evolution should have created a world that is aware of itself because of us and other animals, because of life. With life, I think awareness comes in. It's amazing. It didn't have to happen. It's truly a miracle that it did happen. And then based on that awareness, you evolve something as, with all the bells and whistles of human consciousness. We are not only aware, but we're aware that we're aware. We have meta consciousness. We're very weird, um, in that regard.
How has your work and knowledge that you've gained along the way changed how you live your own life?
Well, as I hinted at, I cultivate consciousness. I try to be more conscious, and that involves, um, checking out on media, whenever I can. I think that this attention economy is really what it's robbing us of is consciousness. Attention is a very important element of consciousness. It's how we choose to allocate it. And the algorithms of social media in particular are have become very effective at uh, hacking our attention. And now I think we have a even deeper problem with the more sophisticated algorithms of AI, which are not just hacking our attention, but they're hacking our emotional attachments in many cases because people really enter into relationships with these machines. Um, so I think that consciousness is under siege, is endangered in some ways, and that it's something that we have to fight to defend. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that. I meditate. I think that is a really great way to be alone with your thoughts and check out
Mhm.
on all the companies that would have designs on your thoughts and your thought process. I mean, our consciousness is very valuable to corporations. They want a piece of it, and they do it by attracting our attention, engaging us, using algorithms to engage us, press our buttons in various ways. Um, but we have to realize what a precious resource it is, and it's limited. There's a zero sum. If you're giving your consciousness to Instagram, you're not using it to attend to your children or your parents or nature. I think being in nature is also a good way to nurture your consciousness. So yeah, those are the ways in which it's changed me. I'm more aware of it as a precious resource and do what I can to protect and nurture it.
If a stranger stopped you on the street tonight and asked, "So, what actually is consciousness?" What's the honest, no hedging answer you'd give them?
I would say that the fact that you are aware, that you are here and you're here, and you know, and that you have this, I would ask the person to think. I mean, think about this space of interiority you have, that you are looking at the world from this point of view of subjectivity. What is that? That is consciousness.
Michael, what are the three takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with today?
That consciousness is precious, that consciousness is under siege, and that consciousness is worth defending. I think those would be the three.
So important. Thank you, Michael. I very much enjoyed your book, A World Appears.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. Well, a pleasure talking to you about it.